You are listening to the Adult Sabbath School lessons for the third quarter of 2022. This is lesson number 12 of the Adult Sabbath School Bible Study Guide in the Crucible with Christ. The lesson is titled Dying Like a Seed and is ready for teaching on September 17. The author is Pastor Gavin Anthony, who was conference president in Iceland when he wrote this series of lessons. Today, your lesson is read by Dr. Percy Harrold. Monday, September 12. Dying comes before knowing God's will. Many Christians sincerely seek to know God's will for their lives. If only I could know God's will for my life, I would sacrifice everything for Him. But even after promising this to God, we still may be confused about what His will is. The reason for this confusion may be found in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Paul is describing how we can know God's will, and he makes an important point. If you want to know what God's will is, you have to sacrifice first. Read Romans 12, 1 and 2. Paul writes that we will be able to test and approve what is God's will in verse 2. Let's read the whole 2 verses. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. 1. We have a true understanding of God's mercy for us. In verse 1, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. 2. We offer ourselves as living sacrifices, as we've just read. And 3, our minds are renewed. And do not be conformed to this world, in verse 2, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It is only the renewed mind that truly can understand God's will. But this renewal hinges on our death to self first. It was not enough that Christ simply suffered for us. He had to die. Ask the Holy Spirit to show you any areas in which you are not completely dead. What things does the Holy Spirit need you to give up in order for you to become a living sacrifice for God? When areas of our lives are not completely dead to self, God permits crucibles to bring them to our attention. However, our suffering not only helps us confront our sin, but it also gives us an insight into Jesus giving himself up for us. Elizabeth Elliot writes in Quest for Love, page 182, the surrender of our heart's deepest longing is perhaps as close as we come to an understanding of the cross. Our own experience of crucifixion, though immeasurably less than our Saviour's, nonetheless furnishes us with a chance to begin to know him in the fellowship of his sufferings. In every form of our own suffering, he calls us to that fellowship. End of quote. And so, to finish the day, read and pray over Romans 12, 1 and 2. Think about the things you need to give up in order to become a sacrifice. How does this help you to understand the sufferings Jesus faced for you on the cross? How can this knowledge help you enter into fellowship with Jesus and his sufferings? Romans 12, beginning at verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.